Hi, everyone. Welcome back. This is Nairobi, and I'm the host of the Power to the Flower podcast. This episode is episode 9, and we'll be discussing what states it's still illegal to consume cannabis recreationally. And we'll also talk about some of those states that have cannabis only legal on like a medical front, and what specific states have failed to go from medical to recreational. This episode has a lot of what we have in all of our episodes, the main theme being the policy and its effects to Black and Brown communities. We're also doing this on the backdrop of what is the more recent news coming out of DC, not just the craziness that we're seeing with obviously the over-policing and what we're looking at becoming more of like a fascist state every single day, but we're talking about what Donald Trump is saying on cannabis. Right now, President Donald Trump is actually considering descheduling cannabis from a Schedule 1 drug to a Schedule 3 drug, which I have mentioned before. And President Biden at the time when he was president on the last year or so, he was also looking to deschedule cannabis, but unfortunately never acted on his chance to do so. There are many different reasons why, I'm sure, but President Donald Trump is taking a more conservative approach to this, whereas President Biden at least was considering the pardons that could go on with these cannabis offenses, and did a first round of that while also doing the Schedule 3 or the descheduling of marijuana through the Department of HHS, which was at the time Secretary Becerra's sort of arm, and he was covering the Health and Human Services Department in DC. Right now, though, we have President Donald Trump looking to change this law, and instead it would allow for not just the studying of cannabis law, but for the current cannabis businesses to be able to get better taxed. And you can imagine behind those arms are lobbyists of all kinds of cannabis companies. But of course, what is lacking in that is the focus on Black and Brown communities and repairing the harms done to said communities. And the Republicans right now, those especially from states like Florida, for example, which the president desperately needs in order to maintain his majority support, are against recreationalizing cannabis. So a lot of the policy talk you'll hear behind this will not be so community of color friendly. Instead, it'll be more geared towards taxation, which is more business oriented and more of the type of policy approach the president has tried to take. Through this approach, however, we're also noticing that the conversation's not just shifting from what states are still illegal to, what is actually happening on the federal level. We're seeing that more people are looking to actually strip away the public enjoyment of recreationally smoking cannabis. And we're seeing this even in states like Massachusetts, where there's actually a ballot initiative by a citizen looking to repeal cannabis in its entirety, on the recreational front, at least, that is. So we also see efforts in New York, not just in Massachusetts, but in New York, where folks are also looking to reverse public consumption because of the horrific smells and the rising crime and all of these things. So there's also policy approaches that have the undertones of what people in cannabis are able to do recreationally, and who's actually getting the benefits of any of these cannabis policy changes. So on this episode, that's what we'll be discussing. But first, let's look at holistically, what are the states that have literally no cannabis laws, no medical laws, and are not looking to have recreational laws. Let's talk about that in a second. The reason why this is important and why we need to cover this topic is because in states where there is no legal cannabis or no legality for cannabis in a medical program or anything like that, there is a gap that happens, right? So there's a serious issue on still criminalizing folks who do consume. And generally speaking, the people who are overwhelmingly criminalized are Black and brown individuals. So we have 40 states that are at least medical use, 24 states that are recreational and have medical and recreational programming. And then we have a solid 9 states out of all of the 50 states that are seriously non-medical and don't have any sort of legal programming for cannabis, even though some of these states may have decriminalized small amounts, or there are efforts right now currently to look at what medical looks like in the future. But for the most part, these are the 9 illegal states. Number 1, Georgia, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, North Carolina, South Carolina, Wyoming, Wisconsin, and Tennessee. This is one statistic that I want to stay with you as you continue to learn along with me on this podcast. Number 1, I want you to remember this number, 3.6. That is how much times more likely a Black person is arrested for cannabis than a white person. Okay, so I want you to keep this in mind, because this statistic, it's just at any given place where there is on this list a Black community, right? We mentioned Tennessee. You can imagine that Memphis, Tennessee, that has a lot of Black folks that live there, and these specific Black communities all around, there are higher rates of criminalization and potential criminality for the future if these things do not ever get addressed. Where there are states there that are legal or recreational, or there are medical programs, you tend to see less crimes on cannabis, but there are still arrests, of course. We just want to make sure that while we're looking to legalize and deschedule, or there's conversations on federal legality, that these communities do not specifically get left out in the process. And while the Trump administration has been known to not specifically be friendly to Black and brown communities on any particular one issue, we do know that there is likely not an interest from this administration to pursue any legislation or to sign off on any legislation that is introduced, including the legalization of cannabis and any social equity or social reparations to Black and brown communities. My dear friends, this is why this platform is important, because we want to make sure that while we are looking at the current policy, we are examining how Black and brown people are affected and how they historically have been in the past. While there were considerations with the Biden administration to assist, right, the Senate and the House, the bicameral legislature, right, the Congress was not in a united front to be able to pass not only the recreational cannabis in general, but also being able to pass laws that would expunge records on a national level for those who have had past convictions. And also, while we're at it, maybe freeing a couple folks that are currently locked up for some of these convictions, albeit whether for possession, for sale, for distribution, manufacturing, whatever the case may be. But as we are considering legislation, we should consider who is still behind and not benefiting from the potential rewards of legalization. In some of these places, maybe CBD is allowed, but again, possession of cannabis, right, can still be criminalized in some of these areas. What I do want to talk about is one state in particular of the ban list, North Carolina. North Carolina is so interesting, okay, because North Carolina is one of the states that does not have legal recreational cannabis, but North Carolina does have legal recreational cannabis in one of the native reservations, right? And that is important to note, because native reservations, although, we know it's a part of these different states, right? It's not really, because tribes have their own tribal lands that was had upon in an agreement with the federal government. And this, even though it's in the same state, you cannot actually go there and buy weed. It's just on tribal lands. And if they decide, the Indian reservation decides that they want to legalize it, then they can do so individually or independently from the state that they are also cohabitating with. And if we want to point to some more staggering data, the Marijuana Policy Project points to the year 2023, and it's over 200,000 marijuana-related arrests. That is insane. And a lot of those numbers come from states where cannabis is still not legal, not recreationally or even medically. That data causes a great divide. It allows us to see that even though the United States is generally more positive and leaning towards cannabis recreational or even legalization on the national front, there is still a stronghold when it comes to arrests and who's actually still being arrested and criminalized for smoking weed. And you're going to hear me talking about this over and over again on this podcast until everybody has learned that we should all be free. Okay, we should all be free from any policies that criminalize our communities and have criminalized us for many, many years, right? And the United States has had a lot of different policies that have developed over time. Firstly, I will just say that hemp was legal and they used to grow cannabis even on Mount Vernon, okay? That's where our good old jolly old former President George Washington was living, right? So these are the type of things that I'm trying to point at, is that a lot of the disconnect between what was and who gets to be criminalized for it still is rooted in policy and politics. More specifically, you'll see that the more conservatives, like the Reagan descendants of the Republican Party, still think weed is a dirty drug and gets people to do stupid things. But you'll see that those who are more democratic leaning or more progressive leaning can tell you straight up that this is just a lot of overly exaggerated, super criminalized, and bombastically enforced policy that literally doesn't even make sense to the person who's sitting in the presidency, in the White House right now. And that's Donald Trump, who he himself has talked about how weed should be legal and has also mentioned that he's looking to decriminalize and deschedule. Now let's talk about the failed adult use states, right? So the way that this happened was that there were some medical states that were already medical, but failed to go recreational. And that was done through ballot measure in the year 2024. So some of the ways that you can legalize cannabis in your state is by the legislature passing it, right? And then the governor signing off on that bill, making it a law. Or you may be able to have a ballot measure, which is usually citizen-led or by a group, an activist group that has come together to put this on the ballot initiative by way of a petition. And then there's different formalities and ways depending on whichever state. But in the state of North Dakota, in the state of South Dakota, and in the state of Florida, they all failed by ballot measure. Florida failed horribly, by 60% was against the Florida ballot measure to be able to recreationally have cannabis in the state. And then in North Dakota, it failed as well. And in South Dakota, so North Dakota, I believe it failed around 57%. And in South Dakota, it failed as well. So one of the reasons behind this is because those are more conservative leaning states. Florida is known to be a lot more conservative. I mean, think about who's serving as governor. Governor DeSantis, right? We also have governors and senators from North and South Dakota that are more conservative leaning. And again, a lot of this has to do with the politics behind this and not just the policy, because the policy is made by the politicians, right, who are looking to get reelected or elected based on their politics. So that's why a lot of this is an issue, and also who funds their campaigns and who funds them specifically on, via lobbying, and also who funds them directly through legislation, which is usually a lobbyist. So that's one of the things that I want folks to consider, is how these things are also made, and why certain states are legal and why they're not, and why certain state ballot initiatives like the Floridian and North Dakotan and South Dakotan ballot initiatives failed, is because of who's behind that, and not necessarily the results of what it could do, but rather who's looking to push it and what sort of agenda they have in order to pass it or not pass it. But one thing to note is that every failure of the legislation that does not pass through ballot initiative is also a continuum of the criminalization of the Black and brown folks that do get arrested. And just keeping that in mind when we look at the disproportionality and who gets criminalized in processes like this. Here are some of the medical states that have stalled on passing cannabis recreational legislation. Number one, we have Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has been legal for medical since 2016, and currently Governor Shapiro supports passing legal recreational cannabis, and he's more Democratic leaning. But unfortunately, the GOP Senate, or the Grand Old Party, which is also AKA the Republican Party, so the GOP has blocked this. That Senate is not interested in having cannabis recreation. In Pennsylvania, Black people are 3 to 4 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis, especially more than their white counterparts. Another state that has stalled on passing recreational cannabis through legislation is my neighboring state of New Hampshire. Hello, live free or die state. We very much appreciate y'all because you bring us business. The folks that are living in your state bring business to the state of Massachusetts, okay, or the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, because Massachusetts is recreationally legal. So a lot of folks will just come over here. Similarly to Pennsylvania, some folks may go to New Jersey and so on and so forth on where they can grab recreational cannabis. But what happens is that New Hampshire then is obviously not reaping the benefits of what it's like to be a legal state, meaning the taxes don't go to New Hampshire. Instead, they come to Massachusetts, which is fine, okay, because there's a lot of inverse of that we do a lot of in both states. Like Massachusetts doesn't really have pro-gun laws, and some people obviously have left Massachusetts to go to New Hampshire where it's pro-gun, and you can see how some of those nuances are very politically divided, even though some of those states are neighboring to each other. So that a lot has to do with, again, the politics behind that. New Hampshire being the first of the nation to be able to go in the presidential primaries has always been more of a hub to politics. And right now, it's a very Republican kind of dominated state, a Republican, especially through the governorship, because Governor Kelly Ayotte just recently said she is 100% opposed to recreationally legalizing cannabis. And that is quite all right. And I totally respect it. But you know what I will say is that the population of Black folks in the state of New Hampshire is really only 1.5, but yet again, 5% of that is mostly, right, the arrests are, guess who? Black and brown folks, because really that's where we're at. Another state which baffles me, because hello, we hear about different strains called Maui Wowie and like all this other stuff, or like, going back to Honolulu just to get that Maui Wowie, that Maui Wowie. Going back to that was a song by Kid Cudi, who was a notorious pothead, okay? But the issue is that in the state of Hawaii, it is not legal recreationally, though Hawaii has had a recreational program for a long time. The reason why this failed is because back in 2024, the state of Hawaii's Senate had passed the recreational bill, but then it stalled. The House killed it completely, meaning it didn't even go through. And so now the legislation is stalled, and we don't know what the future of recreational cannabis is like in the state of Hawaii, which really it's the nation of Hawaii, okay? It really should be back to its own natural self, and we respect Hawaii and its nature and sovereignty. So you already know the vibes. Free Hawaii. Another state that's an honorable mention that I just want to include here, but it already flipped, is Minnesota, because Minnesota recently just flipped and now has a recreational market. But what that means is that this state was also similar to Hawaii, Pennsylvania and New Hampshire, where they had recreational programs, but were stalling on the legislature. Eventually, they come over to the recreational side, and now they have a legal market. So woody woo, that shows us that the gap is closing, honey. And we know this because we see efforts still happening. So now it's just a matter of like what the president is going to do and what the policy will show us in terms of trends moving forward. And while I listed the 9 states that have no medical and no adult use, I also want to mention states like Texas and Nebraska, because although they have medical programs, it is very, very, very limited. And so they still do kind of technically count as states that I would consider as like no adult use, no medical, but they do have some sort of medical program. But some of those states even they only allow CBD. So it just depends. The states are incredibly nuanced, but it is important for you to check your local cannabis policy so that you know where you cannot consume. So here's what I want to say to the Republican folks down in DC and those throughout the 50 states. Okay, aside from just deciding that we want to change the scheduling of cannabis, we should really focus on what equity looks like. And I know this isn't something you all want to hear, Republicans. I know you don't give a shit about Black or brown lives, but it's important for you to do so. Here's why. Because as a nation, when we have more people being productive and able to be with their families, we're all doing better, right? Unless, of course, that's not what you want for us. But that is understandable based on what we see the data to reflect to be, right? On top of that, we also want to be able to reinvest some of these tax dollars that I know you don't want to do that, but listen to me, hear me out. You took a lot away from these Black and brown communities and created a lot of harm through some unjust policies. So if you are looking to change that and perhaps make America great again, what we could do is reinvest these dollars into the communities that were once harmed so that we can be productive in different ways, giving back by making sure that we have investment in parks and through some of these different public spaces. Whatever it is that we can give back to our community, these are one ways that we can do that. And guess what? It won't even touch any of your tax dollars of what you currently have because you don't even tax it. So imagineer that, okay? Imagineer it, meaning imagine it and engineer it. We can actually do this together and we can actually make America great again if we focus on things like this, okay? So again, maybe a long shot, but at least we're talking across the aisle, which is a part of what this discussion is about. People need to see that equity doesn't care about who is in the White House. It's something that needs to happen. Okay, we also just need to fight for the general well-being. The United States is not well. And this is one of those things that if we're looking to change, we should look at the holistic approach on how to make positive change and not celebrate the small wins that really don't consider the greater whole, because the United States is due for a social contract update. We all need to look at how we best treat each other and what we want to be able to make this country more better for everyone while we're looking at policies like this and looking to see how we could change that. So open to talking to whoever across the aisle. If you guys want to talk, I'm here to chat. Anyway, that's it. Thank you so much for tuning into the Power to the Flower podcast. And this is episode 9. We'll see you again for the last episode of the season, and then an update on the season finale, which we will have live and in person. Stay tuned for more details. Bye.